Thomas Cromwell's seemingly meteoric rise made history. He helped King Henry VIII dissolve the English Church from Rome and dissolve the monarch's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. It was he who brought Anne Boleyn to her knees before her executioner when she had transformed from an ally to an enemy. But I would like to tell a different story today and answer why Cromwell was not only able to survive the fall of his patron, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, although he was loyal to him, but only now became a candidate for the Tudor king. What distinguished Cromwell that men like Wolsey or Thomas More could not offer the king? As a small spoiler at the beginning, Cromwell was a man-catcher in many ways. He had a natural sense of what his counterpart desired and what only he could give him or her. And it was precisely this that made him so interesting to Henry, not although he stood by Wolsey at a time that was also privately one of the most difficult of Cromwell's life, but precisely because of it. We have to start at the very beginning. For a man who has shaped history as intensely as Cromwell, it is surprising how much his origins lie in the dark. He comes from Putney, which was a small village outside London at the time. It was located in the commuter belt around the capital and had a ferry that allowed people to reach the heart of the city within 30 minutes. Cromwell was born in 1485, the only son of his parents, Walter and Catherine Meverell. She was from a gentry family. His father was a simple but bustling man. His profession is usually given as a blacksmith. In fact, it is not certain whether he actually worked in this role. As a beer brewer, on the other hand, he undoubtedly made himself busy. In the court rolls of the responsible Manor Wimbledon, there are no less than 46 fines for selling adulterated beer. In general, he often had unpleasant run-ins with the law. In total, Walter Cromwell appears more than 90 times in the court rolls. Among them were two more serious accusations. In 1477, he had to pay a fine for attacking and beating a William Mitchell bloody. In 1513, shortly before his death, he was found guilty of fraudulently destroying sovereign deeds and documents. This had led to the disinheritance and disturbance of tenants of his lord. For a long time, therefore, the image has persisted that Walter was a violent man. Diarmaid MacCulloch, however, vehemently contradicted this. According to him, these are fantasies based on a false understanding of the court rolls. We know very little about Thomas's mother. The only really reliable but not very credible statement comes from him himself and has been handed down by the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis. His mother is said to have been 52 years old when she gave birth to him. Cromwell grew up with two sisters, named Catherine and Elizabeth. Catherine later married the son of a Welsh lawyer. One of the couple's descendants bore the name Oliver and went down in history for trying in vain to convince the English King Charles I not to lose his head. Walter Cromwell managed to change his life for the better after the birth of his children. He became a successful merchant, served as a juror several times, and was elected Constable of Putney in 1495 and 1496. His main task was to keep the peace in his community. It is possible that his son in particular made him worry about this. At least Cromwell told his friend Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, decades later, what a ruffian he was in his young days. For Cromwell's family, this became a problem. His father had risen to become a respected official and a large landowner. He was thus in the public eye and could not need a problematic son. There are two versions, which is why he finally had to leave his parents' household. The Italian poet Matteo Bandello, who allowed himself extensive poetic liberties in his historical texts, wrote that a dispute with his father tipped the scales. According to Chapuis, Cromwell was imprisoned for, quote, some offence. After his release, it was one of the conditions that he would leave the country. As a small side note, Cromwell later invested conspicuously little in land. If you want, you can interpret this as a subsequent rejection of your father. Of course, this cannot be proven. Whatever is true, one thing is certain. In 1503, Cromwell went abroad. He was about 18 years old. According to Bandello, he was first a mercenary in the service of France. He is said to have fought with a pike as a foot soldier in the Battle of Garigliano against the Spaniards. Today, there are doubts as to whether this chapter of his life can be true, even if, for example, John Fox still took the statement at face value in his work Acts and Monuments, published in 1563. The period of Cromwell's life that is more interesting to us begins afterward. Thomas made his way to Italy and reached Florence completely impoverished. According to James Gardner, he would probably have starved to death on the streets here if the banker Francesco Frescobaldi hadn't included him in his household. His family was also active in trade and closely linked to the English crown. For example, it had supplied textiles for the coronation of Henry VII. Francesco's brother, Leonardo, received the prestigious commission to design the tomb of Margaret Beaufort in 1511. For Cromwell, this contact was literally vital. But not only that, he learned the trade of the merchant and travelled with his hosts again and again to the Low Countries, where the European trading hubs of the late Middle Ages were located. Thomas made acquaintances here that should last a lifetime, but he also made valuable connections in Florence. Michelangelo and Niccolo Machiavelli were regular guests at the Frescobaldi house at this time. The latter was entrusted with government tasks during Cromwell's stay. It is my personal conviction that Cromwell must also have studied law during this time. The Italian universities were still the measure of all things in this regard, and Thomas subsequently appeared more and more often as a lawyer. For example, he was several times as a lawyer with the Pope in Rome. According to John Fox, he once negotiated the renewal of a series of indulgences for the city of Boston in Lincolnshire. According to Fox, we meet the creative, solution-oriented, and detail-obsessed Cromwell for the first, whom we know from later all too well. He writes, Thomas, hoying knowledge how the Pope's holy Touth greatly delighted in new-fangled strange delicates and dainty dishes, prepared certain fine dishes of jelly. He also commissioned the 3 musicians to play enjoyable songs. Thus equipped, he waited for the head of the church to come back from a hunt. The Pope is said to have been so attracted by the smells, the sight of the food and the music that he immediately came closer and tasted everything. What he tasted flattered his palate, as he immediately renewed the indulgences for Boston. Tracy Borman assumes that Cromwell now developed a strong aversion to the papacy for the first time because it was so easy to convince the Holy Father. The Pope in question was Leo VI, formerly called Giovanni de' Medici, who was from Florence. Cromwell thus used the knowledge he had acquired during his time with the Frescobaldis. It is unclear when the episode took place. Fox dates it to 1510, but this cannot be true since de' Medici was not pope until 1513. In the rolls of the Boston Bar Guild, there is evidence that Thomas was in Italy on behalf of the city in 1517 and 1518. It is not the only contradiction regarding Cromwell's stay abroad. Although his name appears in the state papers in 1512, in an actually undated document, he himself was with the English merchants in the Low Countries in 1513 and 1514, and in Rome in 1514, representing the Archbishop of York. During his time abroad, He learned Latin, French, and Italian. He also made friendships that lasted a lifetime and served as a network of contacts. An excellent example of this is the businessman John Creek. There is a letter from Cromwell to him from 1523, which excellently illustrates how the exchange of information took place. Cromwell was a member of Parliament for the first time at the time. This is the crucial excerpt. We see that Cromwell describes the topics succinctly, ordered according to how important he considers them to be. He also emphasizes the importance of writing in parables for safety reasons. John Checking's letter to Cromwell in 1527 is an example of what communication looks like in the other direction. In this case, too, the most important things are briefly discussed first. This case is about rumors that circulated about Cromwell. Afterward, personal topics are addressed. By the way, the note at the end that he has received clothes from Cromwell does not only serve to express gratitude. At the same time, it is an indication of the level of knowledge he is at. People often wrote to each other several times in a row without having received a letter from the other side, in between. In the letters, therefore, there is usually an indication of where they are in the mutual communication when they write the letters. Between 1514 and 1516, Thomas returned to England. Later trips abroad were no longer intended to be permanent. He married the wealthy Elizabeth Wykes, and according to Chapuis, worked for his new fathers-in-law for a while. He probably began working as a lawyer immediately after his return to England. In a court role, in which he himself is named as an involved party, the term Gentleman Thomas Cromwell is used. This was the designation for members of professions of the law. Cromwell's biographer, Michael Everett, assumes that he never attended university, but taught himself the necessary expertise. He excludes Italy because it did not teach the intricacies of English common law. However, he may also have stood by a lawyer and learned from him. I see it differently for three reasons. First, Cromwell later took an active part in Thomas Wolsey's projects to establish Cardinal's College in Oxford and a royal school in Ipswich. Detailed questions were discussed. I show two of the sources that I always take from the source collection, Letters and Papers Henry VIII, on the website of the British Library. Of course, it cannot be ruled out that Cromwell has also familiarized himself with the necessary knowledge in depth. In my opinion, however, it is more likely that he had expertise from universities on the continent and was able to contribute it. Second, Cromwell has repeatedly appeared as a legal representative before the two higher royal courts, Chancery and Star Chamber, over the years. Here it was theoretically possible to act as a so-called solicitor below the bar, but he usually represented high-ranking clients. Everett also bases his view on the fact that he later repeatedly sought the support of experienced lawyers, such as Thomas More's, on legal details. In my opinion, however, this speaks more for how much importance he attached to correctness and the proper involvement of the king's leadership. Third, Cromwell became chief steward of the Manor of Tottenham in 1528, and in this role had to regularly hold manorial courts. He was replaced in 1530 by the experienced William Paulet, when Thomas became too important for the government. In my opinion, this position as a judge also indicates that he had completed a full-fledged law degree. Very early on, he was also involved in explosive cases. He probably began his work for Wolsey in some capacity in 1518. At least this is where his account book begins, in which he recorded the list of his debtors. This indicates that Cromwell now considered London to be his home. He was given a very sensitive task early on, which he could only have gotten from Wolsey. He was involved in dealing with the legal consequences of the execution of the Duke of Buckingham. He was a rival of the king. The legal documents had to be watertight to protect Henry VIII. Cromwell corrected numerous drafts. This underlines the great trust that existed in his legal expertise. Thomas was one of the men who legally represented the government. A good example is a letter from John Palsgrave, the English scholar who was to write a textbook on learning French, needed Wolsey's support in his role as Lord Chancellor. This was an official cover letter that would be archived and could be reviewed in court. Cromwell wrote the draft. In this way, we also get to know a little bit about the inner workings of the government. Men approached Wolsey's office with their concerns and found the right contact persons there. Through his work as a lawyer on his own initiative and in Wolsey's staff, Cromwell became acquainted with the concerns and needs of many important people. As an example, in 1527, a certain Sir Thomas Boleyn asked for legal advice. The Viscount of Rochford auditioned for his sister, Alice, who was married to Sir Robert Clear. The couple was in a legal dispute with Elizabeth Finuche, the widow of the late Chief Justice. Cromwell was asked to be of counsel. 2 years later, Anne Boleyn wrote to him directly. There are countless other examples of documents that Cromwell himself drafted or corrected. I show some of them on the screen. The wide range of topics is striking. Cromwell was concerned with the merchant adventurers, the Hanseatic League, concerns from the aldermen of London, the allocation of licenses to work in certain professions, property issues, and the problems of public officials. Thomas was not only able to expand his network, but above all, gained extensive knowledge of what was going on, where and who had what problems. This was extremely valuable knowledge for a lawyer. However, not all contacts served solely to expand Cromwell's general knowledge. He also tied up contacts that could be helpful to him in other ways. An excellent example of this is the private businessman Thomas Twessel, with whom Cromwell was first so acquainted. He was craving to become a royal auditor. Thomas complied with the request and made him auditor of Queen Jane Seymour's household. Cromwell thus had a very good insight into what was happening at the Queen's house. Another good example is Lawrence Giles, the Chandler of Calais. He not only provided him with information and work, but also sent him special delicacies such as quails and herring. These were such masses that we can probably safely assume that Giles expected Cromwell to give them away or serve them as part of larger celebrations. 6 dozen quails are too many for everyday consumption, even for a prominent household at the time. Cromwell thus cultivated contacts with people who could provide him with scarce goods. It goes without saying that this was valuable for a servant of Henry VIII. Another example is William Barreth, who once sent Cromwell 6 plovers so that he could enjoy them with his wife. The sender advised enjoying the dish with wine. Such gifts are also a good example of how Cromwell became increasingly important over time. In order to strengthen his power, Cromwell also used his contacts to establish a patronage system. This means he wanted to have a network of talented people who depended on him. In 1522, for example, William Popeley asked for Cromwell's advice. He appears a few more times in the sources in the following years. Diarmaid MacCulloch was able to show that Popeley was not only a close friend of Cromwell in the 1530s, but one of his leading servants. We also find letters such as that of John Robinson, who asks for a recommendation for Cromwell's wife and mother, and Edmund More asked Thomas to talk to a third party on his behalf. Over the years, the patronage system finally came to light quite openly. John Gostwyk, an administrator, refers to Cromwell directly as a patron in a letter. His curriculum vitae is very interesting in this respect, as Gostwyk had already worked for Wolsey since 1510 and was thus actually in his service much longer than Cromwell. His example also shows how quickly Thomas has risen through the ranks. One means of his advancement was without question money. According to their will of 1529, the Cromwell couple had £600 in cash. Today, this is more than £525,000. At that time, it was almost twice as much as, for example, the entire fortune that Thomas More owned. He used part of this fortune to act as a moneylender. Even very well-known names borrowed money from him. For example, Henry Percy was a debtor to him from 1527 onwards. Through this network of dependence, Cromwell was able to establish contacts with ever wider circles. For example, in the late 1520s, a friendship developed with Henry VIII's Vice-Chamberlain, Sir John Gage. Thomas used the connections he had very cleverly to open doors for himself. In this way, he also had no problems marrying off his son Gregory appropriately. He married the sister of Jane Seymour in 1537. For a year, Cromwell was even directly connected to the king. Cromwell's efforts to establish his own patronage system were aided by his proximity to his own patron, Wolsey. It is not entirely clear when he entered the service of the long-time Lord Chancellor. Everett assumes that this could have happened in 1524 at the earliest, after Cromwell had successfully supported Wolsey in a real estate purchase. A year earlier, Thomas had given a speech in Parliament, criticising Henry VIII. It was not really a direct attack on the king, but it was criticism. Everett considers it impossible that Cromwell could give this speech and work for Wolsey at the same time. As shown, however, he was already involved in the aftermath of the Buckingham execution. This was such a sensitive topic that Cromwell must have worked for Wolsey at the time, at least unofficially. In the sources, we find again and again the request of people that Thomas should intercede for them with Wolsey. An example of this is Henry Lacy's letter to Cromwell, asking for support. In individual cases, the courted man also made this connection on his own. If we remember Sir Thomas Boleyn, for example, the story continued in such a way that Cromwell judged that there was nothing to be gained in court. Instead, the party should contact Wolsey directly. The fact that Cromwell gained a lot of power through his position was of course noticeable. Again and again, there were attempts to make Wolsey doubt him. I show an example that even mentions the king. This was not successful. Wolsey used Cromwell early on to deliver news to the king. In addition, he apparently also felt responsible for his safety. At least we have, for example, a letter from Lawrence Stubbs to Woolley that reports on a planned assassination attempt on Cromwell. Accordingly, the sender probably expected the Lord Chancellor to take measures to react appropriately. It is also interesting how Wolsey used him, especially for the college project. Sources suggest that he gave him some power of attorney to negotiate. This indicates confidence. In addition, Wolsey had obtained the right from the Pope to dissolve 29 smaller monasteries for the planned schools and to use their proceeds to equip the educational institutions. Cromwell was tasked with actually dissolving the 29 monasteries. He carried out this task conscientiously, obsessed with detail, and, if necessary, ruthlessly. These experiences automatically made him the right man when it came to dissolving all monasteries years later. I have already mentioned Cromwell's first term as an MP. As we have seen, he was not very enthusiastic, so it is surprising that he went to Parliament again. This happened in 1529, and it was a reaction to Wolsey's fall. Cromwell had probably chosen this path as a plan B, so as not to be completely without a career after the fall of his patron. On paper, Cromwell was useless as an MP. He did not push through any legislative project. For two reasons, however, his experience as a parliamentarian nevertheless made him excellently qualified to work for the king. First, Cromwell gained extensive experience in writing laws. Secondly, he had a precise picture of the extent to which the Parliament had efficiency deficiencies in his eyes. When we see Cromwell acting as head of government with the people's representation, this becomes clear. Thomas was not an enemy of Parliament per se. He was an enemy of how it worked in the 1520s and started here. He was apparently in line with Henry VIII. After all, the king was not necessarily known for his patience, but wanted his will to be enforced as quickly as possible. Cromwell is famous for how corrupt he was. Some sources speak of Cromwell's fee. I can show an example of how this worked. In August 1526, Alderman George Manu promised Cromwell the sum of 20 marks if he would influence a matter in his favour. The money apparently fulfilled its intended purpose. Only 5 days later, Manu writes again, revealing that in the meantime he has received a response from Cromwell that, quote, greatly joyed my heart. His servant would send him the promised 20 marks as a reward. At first glance, it seems absurd why the king should be interested in such an obviously corrupt man. After all, he should not allow himself to be influenced by money to the detriment of the monarch. However, this impression is deceptive for two reasons. First, Cromwell was also repeatedly asked to pass on gifts to Wolsey and always complied. Thomas did not enrich himself at the expense of his lord. Henry could assume that this was also true for him. Second, bribery also has a social component that is relevant to the upper class. Those who let themselves be bought apparently have no insurmountable principles. Since every new favourite is perceived as a threat at court, bribery is a signal of reassurance. There is an opportunity to influence the favourite. Henry had a blatant counterexample right in front of him. Thomas More was a man who succeeded Wolsey as Lord Chancellor, who possessed certain principles that he would not give up at any price. This led him to the executioner and plunged the government into a deep crisis. Cromwell's, let's say, flexibility on this issue was much more reassuring. However, bribery becomes a problem when it goes so far that loyalty can be bought. There were no such doubts in Cromwell's case. He stood faithfully by Wolsey's side when he fell. I show some sources from this dramatic time. In September 1529, Cromwell received a letter assuring him that everything seemed to be in order. The king had shown Wolsey his normal favour. A month later, everything is different. Abbot Richard asked Cromwell to write a few lines for the prosperity and welfare of Wolsey. The fact that the churchman asked him to do so shows that he hoped to be heard here. 9 days later, Cromwell's friend, Stephen Vaughan, inquired about his well-being and assured him that he would survive the fall of his patron. What is not clear here is that Cromwell suffered the worst tragedy of his life. At the same time, in his private life, his wife and 2 daughters died of the sweating illness. Nevertheless, he remained reachable and stood up for Wolsey. The fallen Lord Chancellor is not the only example of Cromwell's loyalty. Sir Thomas Wyatt the Elder was a prisoner in the Tower in the wake of the Anne Boleyn scandal. His friendship with Cromwell ensured that he was released. Thomas also stood by Sir Peter Vavasour for a relatively long time. However, he could not save him when he took up arms against the king, during the Pilgrimage of Grace. Overall, however, Cromwell said that he remained loyal even when it became disadvantageous or even dangerous for him. This pleased the king. Combined with Cromwell's fortune, knowledge, contacts, and other talents, he was the perfect man to become Henry's nefarious enforcer. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe